He has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.
In the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful, may the peace and blessings of Almighty God be upon you. Welcome to this episode 24 of Press Point, the current affairs programme which analyses events around the world in light of Islam and looking at things from the aspect of true Islam. So today on episode 24, we're looking at the issue of Yemen and the Yemeni conflict. Now, as all of the viewers at home will be aware, of course, there is a very tragic and an ongoing civil war within Yemen at the moment, involving those in the north, who are the Houthis, against those in the south, which comes traditionally from the previous government, which has now been overthrown. But this conflict isn't just related to Yemen, it's now an international conflict in many ways, with proxies being established on both sides, arguably on the one side from Iran in relation to the Houthis, and on the other side, there is a coalition of Gulf states backed by the US, and many of the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, are supporting the former government within the civil war. We want to look at this issue today and to work out what are some of the causes behind this conflict, but also what are the consequences and how is this affecting not only the Middle East, but also the wider world as well. And in order to do this, we have some very special guests within the studio. And as ever, my dear friend and brother, Farooq Mahmood. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much indeed. Of course, we're discussing the Yemen crisis. Yemen being the poorest country in the Middle East. Is it going to really affect us in the West? We are living in a very happy atmosphere. There's nothing wrong with us, with our lives. We are absolutely safe, in a safe haven, or are we? Let's have a look. Let's talk about this. Please send us your emails to presspoint@mt.tv or send us your tweets. But please use the hashtag PressPointMTA. You share with us and we share with the worldwide MT audience.
So Farooq, by the grace of God, we've got two expert analysts who are joining us in the studio today. On my immediate left, we have Afzal Ashraf Sahib. Welcome to the show. Assalamu alaikum. Mr. Ashraf is a well-known security analyst and has been commenting a lot on the Yemen conflict on major broadcasts at the moment. It's a great blessing to have you with us, and thank you very much for joining us. We are also joined by Wasim Khan. Mr. Khan is coming at this from an economic angle and has been involved in economics and also in banking for many years, and is a leading expert within this field and will help to shine some light upon the economic outlook and the economic aspect of the Yemeni conflict. Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the show.
Walaikum assalam.
Thank you very much. Now, we also have Skype guests. One particular Skype guest is Tamim Abu Dhaka. He's an Islamic scholar and he's based within Jordan, and we'll be coming to Mr. Abu Dhaka shortly. So Brother Farooq, let's start and let's perhaps get an overview of the situation in Yemen at the moment. What have you found online?
Brother Jonathan, yes, it is a very complex situation. That's why we've got some experts sitting with us to discuss about this. And the BBC News, this talks just about that. It says the headline is, who is fighting whom? Yemen crisis. Clearly that's the question, who's fighting whom? And what they're saying is, very briefly, the main fight is between forces loyal to the beleaguered president Abdurabu Mansour Hadi and those allied to Zaidi Shia rebels known as Houthis, who forced Mr. Hadi to flee the capital Sana'a in February. But also, it's more, this President Hadi has also now fled the country as well. He's in Saudi Arabia. And again, the bigger issues, in fact, the big forces involved, as well as two big, well-known at the moment, two terrorist organizations, ISIS and AQAP, which is Al-Qaeda's offshoot in Yemen, which is in Arabian Peninsula, seen as one of the most dangerous and most sophisticated of the arms of Al-Qaeda. So clearly this conflict is becoming more and more complicated. To understand it better, perhaps let's look at the geographical location of what we're talking about. It's very important to look at strategically what that means to us and to the entire world. Yemen is in the south of Saudi Arabia and west of Oman. And a smaller country in comparison, but very populous in terms of population. It is basically not very far from Djibouti in east of Africa. And there's a very narrow waterway or strait, which is like a bottleneck there, which is about 20 miles or 20 kilometers in terms of its width, and then it ends up into the Red Sea. So it connects Gulf of Aden and Red Sea. And why is it important? Because if you go up northwest, you can't see in the map here, but very narrow Suez Canal is there, which is in fact a very famous a passage for the oil tankers, if you like. And again, all these kinds of oil tankers coming from Gulf of Oman and Persian Gulf, they go, southwest and then go up to take a shorter route by thousands of miles to come into Mediterranean and to Europe and other countries in the world. So a very important area to start with. I think let's ask this question to our guest, Mr. Ashraf here. Do you agree with the idea that this is a very important location strategically for the world powers as well as those terrorist outfits?
Certainly. You've described one of the important situations here. Economically, oil and gas flow through there. A lot of other trade goods go through that area. So location-wise, it's critical. That's one of the reasons why during the Cold War there was a tension between the Soviet-backed elements within Yemen and the Western-backed elements, really to control this strategic location.
So, Mr. Ashraf, you mentioned the geographic importance, and there's a very rich history within this area of the world. Now that it's entered into a conflict, how significant are these recent developments? How important is this not only for the region but also the wider world at large, this particular conflict?
At the moment, it's not really having a major impact internationally because it is being contained. But when we look at the history of conflicts within that region, over the last 3 decades, these conflicts always start off as being contained and relatively benign. But they continue. I mean, Iraq is a classic example. Of course, Afghanistan is another one that's continuing decades later. And of course, we've seen what happened in Libya, that's still burning. So the problem with these conflicts is that they start off relatively benignly, relatively contained within their boundaries, but they do have a habit of spilling out in the neighbouring regions and sometimes globally, as in the case of Iraq.
And not just remaining limited to that particular area. What about yourself, Mr. Khan? We've heard from Mr. Ashraf the political context and some of the geographic boundaries. How economically important is this area, and how economically important are these developments with this conflict as well?
From an economic angle, if you look at what Mr. Farooq described earlier on as being a bottleneck, because it's across from Eritrea, Djibouti and Eritrea, and that the width of that waterway, that channel, is about 20 kilometers or maybe less than that. That's very small. So any trade passing through that could be impacted. It's not going to impact on the other side the flow of oil, because if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, then that is between Iran on one end and then further down Pakistan and Oman on this side. So that's not being currently affected by that, but it's the other side, any trade that would go through. We also need to realize that there is flow of oil from there because of the Red Sea impact and where Saudi Arabia has its major refineries and so on, and Jambo, which is on the Red Sea port. But so far it's really it's not having a major impact or even a small impact from an economic angle. But as Ms. Ashraf said, if this continues to simmer and grows into a bigger conflict, then obviously the economic consequences would be very different.
Mm-hmm. We know then that this is a potentially very volatile area. We know it's a very strategically important area for both of the parties within Yemen. Behind the conflict, what's going on, Mr. Ashraf? Why is this taking place? Why are we in the situation that we're in today? What would you trace as the meaningful causes of this conflict?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's one that I think that can't very briefly be answered. But there are historical elements that we can explore in some detail later. the historical tension between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. There is the spillover of a country that was once at least partially ruled by British under colonial rule. But coming forward to the contemporary time, what we have here, in very simple terms, is a dictator or a president, Saleh, who ruled for several decades, who was forced to relinquish power through a reasonably election process, a reasonably acceptable election process, and who has wanted to recover that power and has allied with the Houthis, who have various grievances with the government at the time, and also with Saudi Arabia, a neighboring country. So that tension, when the Houthis, encouraged by President Saleh, ousted President Hadi, the current president, that is what triggered this coalition by the Saudis to try and recover the situation, to try and restore President Hadi into power. But as I said, all of these tensions hark back decades ago to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, to the tribalization and the political fracturing of Yemen over decades, including in the Cold War.
Mr. Khan, then, so we know that there's a very numerous causes which have potentially led into this. When we're looking now at the current situation, what's happening on the ground at the moment? Where do we lie? And particularly Mr. Ashraf has mentioned that there's essentially a coalition which is formed. Can you tell us more about this? What's the situation within the wider Middle East context at the moment?
Sure. Apparently there's a coalition of 10 different Arab countries that have joined Saudi Arabia in trying to sort of curb insurgency in Yemen. Now, what actually that means is something different. The countries that have currently joined the coalition with the Saudis includes Egypt as well, and Egypt remains to gain most from all of this in terms of financial rewards. Of course, Egypt will be helping militarily these countries, but Egypt is going to reap the financial rewards by the Kuwaitis and the Saudis and the Emiratis investing in Egypt, and Egypt's economy needed that, especially coming out of the issues and problems that they saw during the Arab Spring, when Egypt's economy had been totally decimated in many ways. So it's rebuilding that economy. But so the economic impact of this is that Egypt gains from all of that, but generally the impact on the local economy is the following. Saudi Arabia in June is going to open up its stock market to foreign investors, which has been totally closed to foreign investment this time. And Saudi Arabia's market capitalization currently is close to $500 billion, which is bigger than the market capitalization of Brazil and Russia, each one of them. So foreign investors have been salivating to get into the Saudi market, because Saudi Arabia has some big industries, especially it has SABIC, which is the largest petrochemical industry in the world. So they want to invest in those. But this development in Yemen puts a level of risk on that. Because if this escalates, then obviously your investments are at risk. So it has a destabilizing impact on the local Gulf economies. So far, nothing. But if it continues and escalates, then obviously there are big impacts.
So can I ask you a question about that? You mentioned about a very interesting area, that's market capitalization, and in fact it's a huge country in its own right, financially and economically. But I was just wondering, I mean, they depend heavily on oil, and oil on its own, is it a good idea, putting all the eggs in one basket? I mean, again, most people are in the public sector working as well. So any blow to oil prices, as it is at the moment, affects the whole economy.
85% of Saudi Arabia's exports are oil and gas. So obviously that will affect them, especially if global oil prices continue to fall as they've been doing so far. And now global oil price is not falling because of this reason, but there are other reasons why, because obviously there's been a glut of them. If you look at the total global oil market in the world, today. At the end of last year, the total demand for global oil was 92.5 million barrels per day, out of which Saudi Arabia was supplying about 10 million barrels per day, which is close to about 14%, 13 to 14%. The rest of the Gulf countries are part of OPEC. Now, Oman is not part of OPEC, but the Gulf countries such as Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, they together formed about 22 million barrels of oil per day, which was close to about 30 to 35% of the total world supply they provided. Now, when oil prices drop, because exports are major, oil is a major export of these countries, their local finances are effective. They do not have the same luxury to A, put money into the infrastructure and development of their countries, which they've been doing so far, and B, political handouts that were being given to the people in these countries in order for them to keep them happy.
But why can't OPEC then cut its oil production then? I mean, to stabilize the prices?
If OPEC cuts, again, within OPEC, you have rifts within OPEC. Okay. So there's no much.
So again, rifts in Islamic world, again, reflecting in the economic world as well then?
By the way, OPEC also has other countries, South American countries in it, such as Venezuela and stuff like that. Okay. But also at the same time, Angola is part of OPEC. So there are non-Arab countries also in OPEC. Ecuador is part of OPEC also.
And OPEC is, what's the acronym standing for?
It's oil producing economic countries. So these are the oil producers. Now, what happens is that over the last decade or so, since 1999, when oil prices started to rise significantly and reached a crescendo of about $140 per barrel, during this period, a lot of emphasis was placed, investments made in oil alternatives and oil-related technologies such as shale oil, for example, that was being developed in huge. So you can see it out here, a lot of fracking.
It's a huge competition for them now, isn't it?
It's a competition. Now what happens is that when oil prices are at $100 to $140 per barrel, the shale oil becomes very important and becomes also profitable to be involved in it. But when oil prices drop down to $50 or $60 per barrel, the profitability of them, because the cost of production is very high in shale oil, for example, or in certain areas of the world where the cost of production is very high. So if you look at the cost of production in Saudi Arabia, it's close to anywhere between $1 to $2 a barrel. That's the cost of production. Whereas if you look at Prudhoe Bay in Alaska, it could go up to $40 per barrel. So when oil prices drop, the production, where cost of production is very high, it starts to become unfeasible and unprofitable.
Okay. So we've had a look at some of the economic angles. We've touched on some of the political angles. We haven't gone into some of the religious angles or the potentially religious angles. So there's a lot of things to explore, which hopefully we'll come to shortly. Farooq, I know that we've interviewed somebody, a leading professor, Professor Scott Lucas, who is the Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. And he's also the founder of Enduring America, which is a website on US politics and foreign policy. So we have an interview with him. Should we go and have a listen to that now and see what his views are on this?
That's a good idea.
Okay. Yep.
We're joined now by Professor Scott Lucas, the founder and editor of EA Worldview, a leading website in daily news and the analysis of Iran, Turkey, Syria, and the wider Middle East, as well as US foreign policy. He began his career as a specialist in US and British foreign policy, but his research interests now also cover current international affairs. Scott Lucas also became a professor of international politics in 2014. Professor Lucas, Yemen has had severe unrest dating back to 2011, and the problems are only getting thicker now with tensions rising between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the issue at hand is of course a big one. The Saudi-Yemen crisis, without doubt, being a very pertinent issue. In your expert opinion, when looking at the present-day situation, do you foresee this to escalate in any further in the future?
I mean, sadly, I think there is no sign of a short-term resolution of the conflict. And I say that because in March, in effect, you had the creation of two separate governments or two separate systems in Yemen. You had the Houthi movement, which was able to establish its power in the capital, Sana'a. It believed that it had to act because it was being shut out of the political process, being discriminated against. President Hadi at that point, who is now outside the country, but at that point he went to the southern port city of Aden and he set up an alternative government. Now, you can't have two governments in the same country. That's only a recipe for conflict. And the problem is that every proposal for a reconciliation has been seen as being unfair. For example, when the Saudis said, okay, we'll have a political conference in Riyadh, the Houthi movement and countries like Iran said, no, that's, we don't want to meet in Riyadh. That already is an unequal arrangement. When the Houthi movement said, okay, we are willing to have talks, but we're only willing to do so if the Saudi-led intervention stops, and if the alternative government disbands, those people who support the alternative government and who have supported President Hadi said, well, no, that's unequal. You really should get back to a process which we had last year, which is one that the UN tried to broker, which is a national dialogue. But that process has reached the point where the UN envoy resigned this week. He simply said he'd had enough. And although he's nominally been replaced, I see no sign of that UN-brokered process resuming in the next few weeks. But to be honest with you, that's what needs to happen. I just don't think it's going to occur right now until both sides realize that they cannot achieve what they want by using violence.
This seems to be a almost never-ending circle. I mean, when troubled matters fall past their expiry dates, a fresh matter always seems to pop up again on the shelves. What's the reason for this? I mean, and more importantly, in fact, how can this be tackled?
Well, the problem has been that Yemen has never had a truly national government. It's had people who claimed to represent the country, but who in fact represented only particular groups or a particular elite. That was the case under former leader Saleh, who for 30 years, let me be honest, ruled very much for his economic and political gain. And although there are many well-meaning Yemenis who said, look, we now have to have a national dialogue to have a national, government, what happened is you had particular factions. So the Houthis, Ansar Allah, who had really wanted power up in the north of Yemen, who had been attacked by the Saudis several years ago for this, they said, look, we're going to protect our interest. You've had groups in southern Yemen, some of whom who've actually wanted to form a separate country, break away, who said, all right, we're going to look after our interest. Former President Saleh has not disappeared. He still has support of some groups within the military, his own militia, so he's fighting for his own interest. So as long as these groups are fighting only for their particular interest, you never get to the point where you have a national reconciliation. And we're further away from that at this point, because what happens is, because of the external intervention, Ansar Allah, the Houthis say, look, if we give way now, we'll be crushed by the Saudis, and we'll be crushed by supporters of President Hadi. President Saleh, former President Saleh, and supporters of President Hadi say, if we give way now, we'll be crushed by Ansar Allah and by the Iranians. I hate to sound pessimistic, but we're at a dead end. The first step, and it has to be step by step, is you have to have a ceasefire. The Saudis have to stop the airstrikes. The Ansar Allah, the Houthis, have to stop the ground attacks on Aden, that port city in the south. They have to go back to the capital, Sana'a, and they have to say, okay, we've ceasefired. Now let's talk about how we're going to implement the ceasefire for a period of months, and that will create the political space to start talking. But at this point, we're not even at the point of getting a ceasefire.
I mean, this matter is, of course, pivotal to the Middle East itself, but in what way do you think this will have an impact on the wider international political spectrum?
Well, I think that's an extremely important question. And I think the first thing is that people need to try to stop, all people. I don't care what faith they are. I don't care what their political affiliation is. People need to stop talking about Yemen as being like this new arena for conflict, whether it be between Sunni and Shia, whether it be between Iran and Saudi Arabia, whether it be between religious and secular groups. You cannot use Yemen as an excuse, as a pretext, to try to inflame the entire Middle East for your own advantage. everyone needs to try to dismiss this. Yemen has to be treated for the problems that exist inside that country. It should not be treated as some type of playground for Saudi-Iranian rivalry or for trying to stoke up sectarian tension.
Very interesting interview. Looking at the CNN now, which says Yemen, who is joining Saudi Arabia's fight against the Houthis? Now looking at the dimension, it's a huge conflict now if you look at the number of different countries involved. And more importantly, the airstrikes are being done in combination with Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, 100 jets. They all add up to more than about 170 odd jets being involved in attacking so-called rebels. Does worry me, and I'll speak to you later, I think, because you've also been in Air Force. Why would you need so many different aircrafts to attack people who are apparently only rebels? But first, let's go to our guest in Jordan, Mr. Tamim Abu Dhaka. Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, we can hear you loud and clear. You are an Arab yourself. How do you see the conflict, not you personally, but also the people in your country and the Arab world in general? Are you guys concerned about this?
Actually, we are so much concerned about the situation because this situation, we cannot say it is a local or it is a civil issue in Yemen. So many now Arab countries are involved in the conflict. And it is natural because what's happened, the weak structure of the Yemeni society caused, it is very easy to have interventions from foreign or outer sides. For example, you know, the Yemenis are divided based on tribal and also sectarian, also southern and northern Yemenis. And all of these things, actually, all of these affiliations, they started to recall and revert and used by the politicians to gain supporters or to ignite more and more this conflict. So the situation is very complicated, and also it can be the beginning for a regional conflict, which is very clearly now, maybe it can be started at any time.
Assalamu alaikum, Mr. Abu Dhaka. Welcome to the show. You're an Islamic scholar, so you're coming at it with the knowledge of Islam as well. If it is possible to say this, then how does Islam view this conflict? And particularly, does Islam say that this type of an approach to have such a conflict as this is this a good approach within Islam? What's Islam's perspective on this conflict?
Regarding this conflict, actually, Islam is always asking every partner, every side, any Muslim countries or parties not to interfere in other people affairs. This is one of the main basics that Allah is ordering the Muslims not to interfere for other affairs. The other thing also, nobody should look at the resources or the wealth which is in the hands of the others. We should not look at these things, and we should always think about the advantage of every nation separately and not looking for our own interests and advantages. The problem now, we have some regional powers, including Iran and Saudi Arabia. They are just only looking for their own interests. And none of them is allowing the other to gain power in Yemen, as well as in any other countries, any other Arab countries. You know, all of these conflicts in the Arab countries, like in Syria and Libya, in Egypt, even in every place where the so-called Arab Spring had been started, the conflict is continual because of the outer interference and the outer advantages and interests of the outer parties, which are the regional powers and also the international superpowers like Americans and Russia. So the problem is like that. Now the Yemenis are fighting, they are not fighting their own battle. They are fighting for others, for the sake of others. And they are fighting just for the advantages of others. And this is completely unjust, and it is against the teachings of Islam.
Mr. Abu Dhaka, what's the reason? Of course, they're fighting other people. They're fighting other people's war. But that's a very common feature now, isn't it? In almost every Islamic country, people are fighting other people's wars. Is it enough to, in a way, criticize the West or whoever else that we are fighting their war? But aren't they Muslims themselves? Can't they understand in such a huge number around the world that this is not Islam?
The problem is that, actually, let's say it is indirectly this thing is happening. But unfortunately, in these certain situations, everybody has started to remember or to revert to its sectarian affiliations and also the regional and the tribal affiliations, and that make it much worse. The problem, escalated because of the weak structure of the society, first of all, and in Yemen, it is really very unique, vulnerable, and fragile structure for the society. So let's say it looks like in every place, unfortunately, in the Arab world, and it looks also in the Islamic world, as they lost the wise and global leadership for the Muslims. These things looks to be continuous, and we pray to Allah these things cannot be expanded and create more disasters for the Muslims and also for the whole world.
Ameen. Ameen.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abu Dhaka, for joining us, and inshallah we'll come back to you shortly.
Jazakumullah.
Mr. Ashraf, we have numerous players that are involved within the conflict. I have a few excerpts from what the various perspectives have said on the conflict. If I could put one of those to you. So the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, Saud Al-Faisal, said on the 12th of April 2015, he said, "How can Iran call for us to stop fighting in Yemen? We came to Yemen to help the legitimate authority," he must be referring to Hadi's government, "and Iran is not in charge of Yemen." What would you say?
Well, I think that last sentence, Iran is not in charge of Yemen, says it all in some ways, because what the Saudis are saying is that this is our backyard, stay out of it. The Iranian rhetoric is very interesting because the Iranians have been saying you shouldn't be bombing Yemen, you shouldn't be killing innocent civilians, and of course there are in any air campaign, but particularly in one like this, which is a counterinsurgency campaign, a high number of innocent deaths, over 600 people, many of whom are civilians, children and so on. So there is this rhetorical war, and all conflicts are primarily rhetorical. So what we hear here is the two sides discrediting the other, and of course the conflict is taking place, and of course the people that are suffering primarily are the civilians involved in this conflict.
Mr. Khan, what's your take on that? They're saying that, Iran, you shouldn't be involved in this, you have no stake in this nation. I mean, this is even to presuppose that Iran is involved. We haven't necessarily had views on that yet. But what's your take on this? Would you agree with Mr. Ashraf on that?
I would tend to agree with Mr. Ashraf because at this stage, and yourself, at this stage, we do not have any proof that Iran is somehow backing the Houthis and that. But then again, what say Tamim pointed out earlier on, that there's a bit of a proxy war being played between the two major Gulf powers in different parts of the Middle East and elsewhere, and be it Lebanon, or be it Iraq, or be it Bahrain, or be it Yemen, or be it even in the Indian subcontinent. So there is that there. The problem with that is that now, with so many Arab countries joining the coalition and so on, the chances of something like this to escalate, it's a powder keg basically, and anything can light that fire, which could and then spread. And trying to contain that fire is going to be very, very difficult. So unless it's contained here where it is, it's going to be a difficult battle for the countries in that region, and then of course the greater Middle East.
Well, let me put a quote to you just to maybe play devil's advocate, even though that's not a very nice term. I wouldn't want to be that, but this is from John Kerry. So he's of course the foreign secretary, or the equivalent in the US, and this on the 8th of April. So it's a short while ago. But I think the US stance is largely similar to this still. So this was on PBS NewsHour, and the title of this article was Kerry warns Iran over involvement in Yemen. So this is just to go back to your statement of whether or not they're involved. This was his take on it. He said there are obviously supplies that have been coming from Iran to Yemen, I infer. There are a number of flights every single week that have been flying in. Iran needs to recognize that the United States is not going to stand by while the region is destabilized, or while people engage in overt warfare across lines, international boundaries in other countries. What do you think about that?
I think if you look at that statement, I mean, we can't look at it in isolation, but if you look at that, and if you see what's happening now with this rapprochement with Iran on the side of the allies led by the Americans, where some kind of an agreement is being thrashed out between Iran on this nuclear deal and the West, which would ultimately lead to the reduction of sanctions that have been placed on Iran since 1979, when the Shah was exiled. So you have a sort of a dual thing going on here. And it's very hard to say to that extent as to what is going to happen. But if you look at the interests of any foreign power, the interests of that power are in the Gulf as well as in Iran. Iran is a big country, 65 to 70 million people, controls 8 to 9% of global known oil reserves in the world. And Iran, that has been in isolation since 1979, if it opens up, guess who's going to benefit from that? It's going to be all the Western companies that are going to go in to redevelop Iran in terms of everything from telecommunications infrastructure to everything else that needs to be done there. So it's a win-win situation. Exactly. It's a win-win situation in the end for the Western point of view. Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. Iran currently produces about 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. It could ramp that capacity up to 3 to 3.5 million within months. And given more money that can be plugged into the enhancement of the oil sector in Iran, within 3 years, 4 years, they could go up to 5 to 6 million barrels of oil per day. If they do that, that adds another 4 million barrels of oil to the total oil supply per day in the world, which is currently about 93 million barrels. So what does that mean? That means oil price will fall further. Who's going to get affected by that? Positively, the Western countries. Negatively, the oil-producing countries.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting take from your end. We are Ahmadi Muslim community, aren't we? I mean, and we are doing the show, of course, on the platform of MT International. And of course, we have got our eye on the entire world. But of course, one thing I must really quote here from the head of the Ahmadi Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, and I think it sums everything up. Azul says that in his Peace Symposium speech of 2015, he says, we the Ahmadiyya Muslim community have no power or worldly influence. Our objectives are purely spiritual, so we do not seek power or government. We have no political ambitions or objectives. So let's make it very, very clear that what we're doing here, in fact, is only to uncover the face of Islam to the world and show to them that our job is based on two parts. One is being servants of the Almighty Allah and fulfill His rights, and also the rights of the fellow human beings. And that's exactly what we're doing here, trying to find the problems. Not necessarily we're saying we'll ever partake with Iran or America or whatever. It's a very muddy ground. And as Ahmadi Muslims, that's not our job. We pray for them first of all. Something else to bring in. There is a research paper published only a month and a half ago by the Chatham House, a research paper by Peter Salisbury, Middle East and North Africa Program, February 2015. I'll put it up on my screen if I can. Only very short quote, and I think let's discuss on that slightly. I think it's very, very important, an eye-opener. And this report says, and I read, which is as follows, keep Yemen weak, King Abdulaziz is reputed to have said on his deathbed, encapsulating long-standing fears that a strong Yemen could prove a major threat to domestic Saudi security. Now that is a very big claim, isn't it? That on a deathbed somebody is dying and says to his sons that you've got to be watching out. Yemen could be a danger for us in whatever way. What's your take on that?
Well, it's hard to know how accurate that is, but clearly if somebody from a respected think tank such as Chatham House is quoting it, it almost certainly has a great deal of provenance. But if you look at recent history, whether or not that was the intention, the results seem to fit it. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the region. It has been destabilized, and Lucas just said earlier in the piece that Yemen has never really had a government of national unity in decades. And so in reality Yemen has been weakened and has remained weak. And whatever the fears were of the Saudis, they seem to have been realized in that it has remained unthreatening until now, when the Houthis suddenly appear to have captured a great deal of land, have ousted the previous president, and looked, as a few weeks ago certainly, to be in a position to restore Saleh or another government that might have been a bit more obliging towards them.
I think Professor also supports when we mention that a number of countries have got together to attack them as air forces. You've also been yourself in RAF as a senior officer. What is the logic behind killing so many people as airstrikes? I would even prefer boots on the ground if anything has to happen. I mean, this seems less of the evils, apparently. You're killing people, whoever is killed, you don't even care?
Well, you've really asked two questions there. The number of air forces involved, the number of countries involved. That, whenever you have a coalition, it isn't a coalition that is necessary for military purposes. It is primarily for political purposes. So when we go back to the 1990 scenario when Kuwait was overrun by Saddam and a coalition was put together of almost every country in the world, all the major countries in the world, including Syria, on the side of the US. The US didn't need those air forces or those boots on the ground. The US was more than capable of dealing with it. In fact, 95% of the activities in the air were US. Others were there really for political purposes. In terms of using air power to carry out what is essentially a counterinsurgency operation, the thinking of the Saudi-led coalition and its behavior, when you look at it, is very similar to the coalition that the Americans put together 25 years ago almost against Saddam in Kuwait. At that time it was believed you could do a great deal, and of course you could do a great deal because Saddam had a conventional army and a conventional air force. An army is very easy to take out with another conventional force because they've got bases, they've got weapon systems, they've got command and control centers, and you could take those out within hours. 100 hours it took to take them out using the air campaign. Unfortunately, what the Saudis haven't caught up with is the lessons that the Americans and the West has learned somewhat painfully in subsequent interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, that once you get into a counterinsurgency and counterterrorism campaign, then air power can be counterproductive if not used judicially. And when you see the briefings, the daily briefings that the Saudis give on their air campaign, they could be almost exactly the same as those that Norman Schwarzkopf gave 20-25 years ago. They just haven't caught up with the reality of modern counterinsurgency warfare and the modern counterterrorism warfare.
Well, Mr. Ashraf, you know, I think in the forefront of many countries' minds, or at least the public's mind, will be looking at the situation in Afghanistan with the attempt to remove the Taliban or Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, and the Russians were unable to do so because of mountainous terrain and conventional warfare. I mean, in even Vietnam, is there a risk that for the coalition that are going in to bomb in Yemen, that this could become, in effect, another Vietnam for those powers, where they're completely unable to remove what they consider to be a rebel force within Yemen?
There's every danger that this becomes a quagmire on a par with Vietnam, on a par with Afghanistan, and indeed on a par with Iraq. And that is because if the Houthis evolve in the way that other modern insurgencies have, they will realize that air power, modern air power, is devastating. And so they will not assemble their forces in the open. They will realize that they can't store their weapons in weapon storage areas. And already we know from the Saudi briefings that they are storing weapons in houses. And of course, when you start targeting houses which contain explosives, you don't have to be a military expert to realize the devastating effect that can have on a neighborhood. And of course, in that neighborhood, you'd have civilian casualties. So the natural progression for an insurgency is to adapt. And insurgencies, in general terms, their strength is the ability to adapt. The conventional forces' strength is the ability to react. Those are very different things. And so given time, the Houthis have already begun to adapt. And if they follow the classic route, they will collapse into urban areas. Then the Saudis will be faced with the problem of when can they declare success? Can they bring in Houthi? Because that's their mission, is to Hadi, to restore President Hadi. Well, if they don't do so through air means, the only choice they have is to have boots on the ground, as you put it, and then we start getting into a long-term counterinsurgency, counterterrorism war.
One wonders if in the end Saudi Arabia themselves are the losers, to be honest. I mean, and there could be somebody else gaining outside who's not even around in the Middle East. You never know what it's going to be in the future. Let's look at now the future. What should be done? I've got an article, one of the press releases going back in 2013 on alislam.org as a press release by the Ahmadi Muslim community. I've just got a very short excerpt from the speech of Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the Khalifa of Islam, who we believe to be rightly guided from the Almighty Allah. The context was Syrian war, and I think one sentence in a way tells us what needs to be done even now. Masroor says, in reality, it was a task of the Organization of Islamic Conference, OIC, to unite together and work towards peace in the region. And nobody's even mentioned OIC here. Where are they? And of course, I think going forward with that, perhaps it may be a good idea to speak to our brother Tamim Abu Daqqa in Jordan. And could you please expound on this, the solution? We know there's only one solution. What is that solution in plain English for everyone to understand?
Unfortunately, the solution is very simple, but it's not easily be attained. This is a problem. The solution is, as Hadrat Khalifatul Masih V, Hadrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad mentioned, that all of the Muslim countries and organizations should sit together and search for peace in Yemen and in other parts of the region. But the problem, unfortunately now, they are not able to sit together. And now the differences and the conflicts between the two parties, mainly now the Sunni and the Shia parts, became very wide, very deep, and it's not easy to bridge this conflict or to bridge this huge difference. And let's say it is completely, I think it's also out of their control because they are also used by the superpowers. So this is the problem. It is simple, very simple. The Muslims should always think about their own interests. They should unite again. They should think as they are one nation. They believe in one God, in one prophet. They have one book. But unfortunately, their differences and their interests, which are mainly political interests, created all of this and make it very difficult to be attained.
Sorry.
Mr. Abu Daqqa, you've mentioned the guidance that's been given by the Khalifa of Islam. Yes. And he particularly has said that this is a problem of leadership and that there is a lack of leadership within the Muslim world. How relevant is that? And as an Arab yourself and being of Jordanian descent, how much do you feel that there is a yearning within Yemen, within the Arab world, for leadership, and how does that feed into this conflict here?
Yes, this is, it is so clear, you know, this is the lack of leadership. The lack of leadership has caused all of this. And unfortunately, you know, let's say a huge corruption was running all over the Arab world, and especially in Yemen. The corruption is linked with the sectarian affiliation, with tribal affiliation, which make it so much complicated. And also, you know, the Yemenis now, they are divided again. They are started to remember the southern and the northern regions. So the northern people do not let, or they do not want the southern people to be in power. And the same as the southern, they do not want the northern people. So let's say it is really, if you look deeply in this conflict, you will find it really very unique and very strange, which means you can find supporters and fighters for each side, while they have so many differences, and they can be easily united if the leadership can guide them through the right passage. But unfortunately, you know, they are playing with the interests of Yemen, playing with the lives of the Yemenis, just to gain control and to gain power.
Leadership, lack of leadership. I mean, we can also tell the world if people don't know it. We have a leadership been there for the last 107 years, tried and tested by the world, which converts fear into peace, as the Quranic promise. On the other hand, the whole world is converting, or many powers are converting, peace into fear. So maybe a good idea for people to know a bit more about the Ahmadiyya Khilafat, how the leadership converts fear into peace. And we're very lucky to have the direct guidance by Amir al-Mu'minin every week on a Friday. So let's go back and see what Hazur has said recently about the incident, about the problem that's brewing within that region and may engulf the whole world in that fire.
اس وقت مسلم دنیا کی حالت قابل رحم ہے. لیڈر عوام پر ظلم کر رہے ہیں. عوام انصاف اور رہنمائی نہ ہونے کی وجہ سے, نہ ملنے کی وجہ سے لیڈروں کے خلاف لڑ رہے ہیں. ہر مفاد پرست لیڈر بن کر اپنا گروہ بنا کر بیٹھا ہوا ہے. مختلف فرقے ایک دوسرے کی گردنیں کاٹنے کی کوششوں میں مصروف ہیں. پہلے اگر شیعہ سنی فساد ہوتے تھے تو حکومتیں کنٹرول کر کے امن قائم کرنے کی کوشش کرتی تھی. اب حکومتیں ہی فرقہ واریت کی جنگ میں ملوث ہو گئی ہیں. عراق, شام, لیبیا کے حالات تو بد سے بدتر گزشتہ سالوں سے ہو ہی رہے ہیں. اب سعودی عرب اور یمن کی مدد, جو حالات ہیں وہ بھی بگڑتے جا رہے ہیں. سعودی عرب یمن کی مدد کے بہانے جنگ میں کود پڑا ہے, اور یہ حالات ہی بد سے بدتر ہو رہے ہیں, اور اب پتہ نہیں کہاں جا کے رکیں گے. اس جنگ کے وسیع تر ہونے کا بہت بڑا خطرہ ہے. طاغوتی طاقتیں مسلمانوں کو جس طرح کمزور کرنا چاہتی ہیں وہ اس میں کامیاب ہو رہی ہیں. پہلے یہ تھا کہ براہ راست حملے ہوتے تھے, اب بجائے براہ راست حملوں کے آپس میں لڑا کر اپنے مقصد کو حاصل کر رہی ہیں یہ طاقتیں. اور مسلمان دنیا کو سمجھ نہیں آ رہی کہ یہ کیا کر رہے ہیں. یہ سوچتے نہیں کہ اس کی کیا وجوہات ہیں, اس کے نتائج کیا نکلیں گے. یہ بھی نہیں سوچتے کہ کیوں اللہ تعالیٰ کہ اس آخری نبی کے ماننے والوں میں اتنا فتنہ و فساد ہے. کیوں ترقی کے عروج پر پہنچ کر زوال کی پستیوں میں تقریباً تمام مسلمان ملک گر رہے ہیں. اس زوال سے بچنے اور ترقی کی منزلوں پر دوبارہ چلنے کا صرف ایک ہی ذریعہ ہے, اور وہ ہے جو خدا تعالیٰ نے بتایا کہ اس مسیح موعود کو مانو جس نے آخرین کو پہلوں سے ملانا. فرقہ بندیوں کے بجائے ایک امت بن کر مسیح موعود اور مہدی موعود کے ہاتھ پر جمع ہو جاؤ. اللہ تعالیٰ انہیں یہ توفیق دے. اس کے لیے ہمیں بہت دعائیں کرنی چاہیے. اللہ تعالیٰ ہمیں بھی دعاؤں کی توفیق دے. और उन्हें कबूल भी फरमाए।
Mr. Ashraf, where do you see this conflict going, and how can what's the solution? How can we lead this conflict towards peace?
Well, to lead this conflict towards peace requires those involved in the conflict to want to talk peace. Peace is not something that can be externally imposed, and so really it requires the Saudi coalition to look at and propose a peace plan, and it requires the other side, that will be primarily the Houthis, and of course their supporters, the previous Sahli regime people. But then of course it isn't that simple. It isn't a two-sided conflict. That's, I think, one of the myths that's been created in the public discourse. The problem here of course is that we have others involved. We have two of the world's worst, most dangerous terrorist organizations. You've got Daesh, or so-called Islamic State, and we've got Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And both of those organizations have perfected the art of exploiting ungoverned space. And these are the organizations that are gaining and are most likely to gain out of this conflict. Already Al-Qaeda, for example, has captured a base, an Air Force base. It's captured an armament depot. It's captured a port. And this is a very new territory for Al-Qaeda. Unlike Daesh or Islamic State, Al-Qaeda never really had territory. And the success of Daesh has been because of it capturing territory. So this is not an easy conflict to resolve. It is not two parties. There are three, there are four parties. And the one big party that's missing here is the public. What the Saudis are doing, what the West has done, the reason why the Arab Spring happened and wasn't foreseen by America's intelligence services and others, is that international relations has historically been about leaderships of states, leaderships of international institutions, leaderships of rebel movements. What people haven't been thinking about are publics, people. And in the modern world, it is ordinary people that have an increasing amount of power. And you now have over 150,000 people displaced in Yemen alone. There are millions displaced in Syria. There are millions of people in Saudi Arabia who aren't happy with what's going on. Saudi Arabia declared that Pakistan was part of the coalition. The Pakistani government, parliament said no. And one of the reasons why they've said no, and one of the reasons why governments are not really taking it on board, is that the use of air power against civilians in the Muslim world, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in Afghanistan, has a particularly negative resonance. It is associated with colonialism. It is associated with Western aggression, whether it's true or not. That's the way people perceive it. And now to have Muslims using the same tactics against fellow Muslims is discrediting the Muslim leadership in the eyes of the wider publics in the region. And so these are very dangerous mixtures to achieve a peaceful solution in.
Yes. What about yourself, Mr. Khan? Because I think we've heard from Mr. Ashraf that actually democracy is something which is very important here, and that people hold power, and if you ignore that, it's at your own peril. What do you think?
I think that we haven't seen democracy in most of these countries. And the Arab Spring, when it started back in 2011, 2012, was a bright light which suggested that perhaps these countries would come to democracy or would establish democratic institutions in these countries. That has not happened. And where the Arab Spring started, you have chaos there now. Part of the reason has been because the dictators that ruled those countries made sure that the opposition was totally incapable of governing if they were to leave. So there was
Mr.
no
Khan,
development.
We're very close to time. It's not your fault. It's the nature of time, isn't it? But what would you say if you were to really say this is what we need to do within half a minute? What would it be?
We need leadership, and we need proper leadership that would join together the Ummah, because at the end of the day, we are Muslims, alhamdulillah. We believe in one God, one Prophet, and the Holy Quran. And we should.
And perhaps also, as Azuz said, two things: accept the Prophet Messiah, salam, the God-sent leader, and do prayers. Absolutely.
Well, there's a very, very swift and very powerful summary. So, viewers at home, thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Ashraf and Mr. Khan. Thank you so much for joining us. Farooq, I think this topic is so important. We could have 2 hours to go into it in depth. But very incisive analysis, which made this show very, I think, quite important for the viewers to pay attention to, in my opinion. Mr. Abu Dhaka, thank you very much for joining us from Kababia. So that's all we have time for today. That was episode 24, looking at the Yemeni crisis. As my brother Farooq mentioned, I think pay attention to what the Caliph of Islam has said there. That in fact, while you look at the economics, you look at the politics, don't forget the spiritual, because the spiritual underpins all of these other elements. And if he is right in what he says, which of course we as Ahmadi, or myself and Farooq as Ahmadi Muslims believe, then accepting that individual who's been sent by Allah, therein lies the solution of the Arab world, and therein lies the political and economic solution as well. Let's all reflect upon that, and also please engage in social media and send some in, and let's have your thoughts on it. Thank you very much, and inshallah, assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. We'll see you in the next show.
Has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.